Hi guys, my name's Seb Tudor, I'm the man on Silver Mountain and welcome back. Now today I want to talk about the Google Memo on Google's kind of ideological echo chamber and all of that kind of thing that came out the other week. The both upset a lot of people for various reasons, mostly seemingly because they were being questioned, but also upset an awful lot of people in regards to the responses that occurred around it. Now, for those of you that don't know, first thing I'll do is I'll go through some bits and pieces from the 10-page document that I had a flick through and a kind of read through earlier, and then I want to take a look at the kind of discussion that came around afterwards with the various responses from people, and then I want to go and take a look at the actual science elements of it, because to one degree or another, this is also stuff that I talk about a lot in regards to the differences between the different sexes and the differences between gender and sex and the difference between kind of how individuals work compared to generalizations and things like that. And so as a result, I want to go through all of this because it seems to have blown up beyond all measure, and it kind of, I feel like the responses highlight more that backs up the initial claims made than the manifesto, memo, whatever you want to call it, said in and of itself. So to go to the memo itself to begin with, he the writer, whose name I think was, I've lost his name, James Damore, who was apparently a tech engineer at Google, who was also working towards a PhD in systems biology from Harvard, which seems to one extent or another maybe have inspired some of the things that he was addressing with this. But at the top of his thing, he makes it very clear that he's not saying that sexism doesn't exist. He's not endorsing the use of stereotypes. He's not doing anything else. He's just trying to address a problem that he sees within a company that arguably I would imagine he probably quite enjoyed working with, because otherwise why would he do this? It's in terms of his motivations. I mean, I realised that there were a couple of interviews with him that I've not actually sat down and watched in full as yet, but at time of recording. But why would you do this if you didn't care enough to hope to improve? There's an awful lot in here that's very dispassionate, that's very kind of focused on kind of decent information, and moreover it's constructive because he actually makes suggestions later on in regards to fixing the problems that he's looking to see. And that is usually a big difference between someone doing something for the good of those around them, or people who aren't doing it for anyone but themselves. And I talked about this in one of the management videos I did ages ago. But again, it kind of comes down to, if he's there and he's going, okay, well, this is the problem that I see, this is how I'm working through it, and this is then the way that I see we could move forward with it and maybe embrace it more and maybe solve some of the problems that we're seeing, that suggests that he's willing to work on it. It's a problem that he wants to help solve and not anything else. But anyway, let's take a look at his TLDR that he put at the top. And it's 6 points here, and I'll just read them out to you. Google's political biases, their bias has equated the freedom of from offence with psychological safety, but shaming into silence is the antithesis of psychological safety. Can't disagree with that. That's fairly straightforward. This silencing has created an ideological echo chamber where some ideas are too scared to be honestly discussed. Again, we've talked about this before, where it's a case of either one extreme or the other on the political spectrum shouting down people over raising legitimate points that are supported. But we'll get on to more of the responses and reactions later. The lack of discussion fosters the most extreme and authoritarian elements of this ideology. The extreme being, all disparities in representation are due to oppression, which we hear an awful lot nowadays, but there's evidence to directly kind of suggest the opposite. And authoritarian, we should discriminate to correct this oppression. And again, this is something that we're seeing on both extremes, where authoritarian views, controlling views, are becoming much more prevalent, a lot more groupthink, a lot more us versus them. And we're seeing that kind of snowball. And then he puts down the differences in distributions of traits between men and women may in part explain why we don't have 50% representation of women in tech and leadership. And realize he says in part. It may be a big part, it may be a small part, but he's pointing out that this is something that we need to take on board and look into and use. As I've said, men and women are very different, and yet still what it comes down to is it's not one is good and one is bad, they're both two sides of the same coin. They have different sets of strengths that complement one another, and as a result you can get more by putting the two together and getting them to work together than not. And he goes for discrimination to reach equal representation is unfair, divisive, and bad for business. And yeah, I would agree. If you're actively discriminating against the best person for the job just based on one of their slew of protected qualities, like their gender, their sexuality, their race, whatever, then yeah, you're not getting the best person for the job, in which case it's going to be detrimental for your business over time. But anyway, then he rolls through a lot of his reasoning, which is fairly straightforward. You know, he goes through the Google biases, where he's saying they have left biases that tend to be much more in regards to compassion for the weak, and disparities due to injustices that they want to correct, and humans are inherently cooperative, when that's a thing that you can argue about, but then they're very idealistic. They want to change things overall and for the better, and that change overall is good when, you know, there has to be a balance there. And then he goes through some of their right biases, where, you know, he's saying that humans have to be also inherently competitive, and they have to respect authority, and they have to work within the framework, and where they end up being kind of very open and idealistic in some ways, but then they're very, very closed and locked away and secretive in regards to, for example, the fact that YouTube doesn't communicate very well with people. You know, the fact that with YouTube, one of their most interactive platforms that are attached to Google, they put out a thing the other day about the demonetization side of things, and it has everyone worried, because it seems to be them going, oh well, we're putting in this new system that's already been here for 2 years, and we're going to tell you that it's going to be more specifically used, but we're still going to leave the specifics actually up in the air. We're not going to give you a proper list. We're not going to allow you to see where your videos lie relative to what we're judging on. You know, there's a lot of stuff around that. But then he suggests not a collection of non-bias causes for gender gaps in regards to population, in which case he's talking about the kind of sex differences between male and female, underlying traits that kind of follow on from upbringing and from the nature versus nurture side of things, and all that kind of stuff, as well as the evolutionary psychology perspective, which again is him invoking evolutionary psychology, which is very, very hard to actually kind of debunk and move away from, considering the strong wealth of evidence that supports it across both the human race and all manner of other species, especially mammalian species across the planet that have had research done on them. You know, he raises those as causes that maybe not kind of count for the entire thing, but count for at least a part of it. At which point then he goes into the personality differences, the kind of general traits that tend to separate men and women apart. You know, the female more openness, more in the way of communication and things like that, but tend to be more risk averse. And then kind of men with driving for higher status and driving for ambition far more, and being risk takers and all those things that are kind of not just a thing that you would see out on the street when observing men and women, but also stuff that is very well supported by science, and we'll get onto that in a bit. But then he goes into non-discriminatory ways to reduce the gender gap between male and female working within Google. And so at which point, this is the thing that really stood out to me, because even in this part, before he gets to some of his suggestions at the end, he's talking about how kind of software engineering and stuff like that tends to be very task focused, which is a thing that tends to be much more male mindset, whilst women tend to show more, on average, a more communicative and a more people focused side. Yeah, it's the reason why guys don't get invested, as on a general scale, as in things like rom-coms or romantic kind of stories and things as much, and they're usually the ones that are sat there being bored through it, because it's all people focused. There's no action, there's no activity going on. It's solely between those people, and those people aren't necessarily going to, if there's nothing for them to sympathize with, if there's nothing for them to tag on to, then it's going to be more boring for them. Whilst a woman with the more social focus and the more people focused, more emotional focus, they may very well get into that far easier and stick with it for longer. And so, but he starts raising these points, talking about how, on average, women show more interest in people than men, because men show more interest in things, which, again, going all the way back to the tribal analogy here, when, caveman analogy, yeah, if a dude is out there with a group of others hunting, he needs to focus on the target, not the other people, because if they get injured, he can't just stop and go and run and help them if the risk is still there. He needs to task focus first, people focused after. Women, though, in the more kind of gatherer, kind of caregiver kind of role within that community, for the most part, they're going to be far more focused on and attentive towards the other people, because the other people, their discomfort, their issues, they are more likely to be the things that kind of raise red flags, cause alarm, bring them to kind of go either to protect or aid or whatever else. And so it stands to reason. But here in this memo, then he goes on to say, with in addressing this section on non-discriminatory ways to reduce the gap, he goes, well, this is the case, why not make the way that we work, the software engineering side of things, more people oriented, more focused on collaboration, more focused on communication, which just from the few YouTubers the I've seen kind of go through this whole thing and everything else, they're like, yeah, if Google, if they have a way of changing their working practices so that even the software development on YouTube, the software development on their largest platform with the largest amount of interaction on it, if they were able to open that up and make it more collaborative, make it more communicative as it once was, and surpassing that, then yeah, that, if there were more women involved in doing that, because they were far more kind of focused on the communicative and collaborative side, great. He's talking about going, look, these people have strengths, but they're different to the strengths that are generally being perceived. Women have, on average, these traits, and they tend to be, very much more focused on these things, and so let's incorporate them into the way we work so that they are going to be very, very capable and able of moving into these things, instead of having to conform to a working practice that doesn't really sit well with them, on the deepest, most natural level. But then he goes into the harm of Google's biases, where he's talking about how programs for mentoring and various classes are only for people of a certain gender or race, which again, that's just withholding enrichment from your team, which is going to have a detrimental effect on your business overall. Higher priority queue and special treatment for diversity candidates. Again, if you're the best person in the right place at the right time for the right job, then you shouldn't need special treatment or any of this. It should just be that you have been hired to do the job. You are applying yourself in a way that is better than the other candidates. And so as a result, yeah, if these people are giving special treatment to diversity candidates purely because they're diversity candidates and not because they have other traits that they are looking to cultivate or develop because they stood out as the best for that position in that time, then that's not going to do like a great thing for the business either. It's going to distract and remove assets from those that could actually do more with them. And then it says, and then he goes into their hiring practices and how, you know, it's effectively lowering the bar for diversity candidates, and as a result, you know, that's going to kind of create a more kind of detrimental effect over the whole team if you're continually accepting people who are suboptimal, subpar, just because their diversity quota isn't fulfilled and this person would help that. And then, you know, going and taking a look at, he talks about their biases again in regards to considering groups that aren't diverse enough, or diverse enough, but then not going back and taking a look at why that's the case or where that's come from, or if those people are actually still performing to the best of their ability, then what's the problem? And so he goes through all of that. Then he goes through the reasoning as to why they're blind and why he feels it's an echo chamber. But then he goes into his suggestions. And these suggestions, I think, are really good. You know, not 100% with every single one of them, but for the most part, again, they're dispassionate. He's not going on a rant. He's thought all of this stuff out and he's put it into a very kind of straightforward and open format to be addressed. And you know, he's looking again to stimulate conversation, which is a good thing. And so he goes, demoralize diversity, because once it becomes a moral issue, then people who are kind of disagreeing with diversity or questioning it or having this kind of discussion, they become the bad guys because they are working against the thing that has been deemed moral. In which case, yeah, I completely agree. Diversity, hiring policies, things like that, they should be completely removed from morality. They should be completely removed from that kind of thing, because you don't want to start regarding anyone in the us versus them thing when you're looking for the best person for the job. It says stop alienating conservatives, which again, fair enough. I do find that conservatives tend to focus much more on ideas and positions that are fairly negative in various ways, and they have been doing it for longer, so some of those ideas are on average, and so some of those ideas are out of dated quite substantially. But then again, the left is catching up fairly quickly, because you've got people talking about decolonizing science when, you know, that makes no sense. And so, but he's going, you know, making sure that you've got, you know, the customers that you're dealing with, the people that you're dealing with as a whole, they're diverse. They're both left and right, and they're all using your products. And so as a result, making sure that your teams reflect that and are diverse between left and right, and you know, progressive and traditionalist, liberal and conservative. You know, he's saying that you need to have that for a very mature company that can kind of get further, because you're looking for good ideas from both sides. He's arguing almost for what I argue in regards to taking, regardless of your natural inclination on politics, taking that centre point so that you've got the highest ground on the whole spectrum to kind of take a look and see the good ideas from all quadrants. He talks about confronting Google's biases, and so he's talking here very much more about, again, the moral side of things, and making sure the people are looking at it and breaking down the kind of political and personality side to give a much fuller picture of the overall cultures, the overall biases that run through the culture at Google. You know, taking a look at individuals, taking a look at collective teams, and then taking a look at the company as a whole to break it down and see where things are going. You know, and then he's talking about stop restricting classes and programs to specific genders or races, which again, if you're allowing anyone to take them, then especially those people who might need them more regardless of race or gender, then great, it's non-discriminatory and you're enriching your entire workforce potentially. That's great, that would be really helpful to you. I don't see any reason why someone would flip out against that. Have an open and honest discussion about the costs and benefits of diversity programs, in which case just again turn it all into numbers and weigh it up. You know, whether or not you are losing money to kind of diversity candidates that have come in to the company and aren't performing as well as candidates that they were compared against that were deemed not diverse. You know, he talks about the adding transparency to the diversity programs and initiatives and things like that, so that they aren't immune from criticism, and so that the ideological echo chamber can break down if if there is a solid one in certain areas, especially around hiring. He talks about kind of removing the politicized kind of atmosphere around these programs as well, and then he moves forward. He talks about focusing on psychological safety as in actual psychological well-being and not just kind of supposed safe spaces for races and genders and other protected characteristics. He's talking about it for everybody across the board, big blanket policy. He talks about de-emphasizing empathy, which I get what he means here, I think, because he says that he's heard several, well, I'll read it to you. I've heard several calls for increased empathy on diversity issues. Whilst I strongly support trying to understand how and why people think the way they do, relying on effective empathy, feeling another's pain, causes us to focus on anecdotes, favour individuals similar to us, and harbour other irrational and dangerous biases. Being emotionally unengaged helps us better reason about the facts, which I'm agreeing with here, because as much as you can empathise with an individual, you shouldn't start randomly empathising with entire groups, especially when you're a company. A company should be an unfeeling entity that treats all of its employees equally within the terms of their contracts and within the policies and the laws laid out in front of them. If you're going to start doing stuff like this, where increased empathy for diversity issues, again, this is where you start getting kind of groupthink, lots of us versus them, and a breakdown in kind of the way that things function over time. But then prioritize intention. He's saying that the microaggressions and other unintentional transgressions increase sensitivity because of the focus that are put on it, which isn't a universally positive thing. And he goes that things like microaggression training kind of incorrectly and dangerously equate speech with violence, and it isn't backed with evidence, which again I would agree. Words don't, as I've said in one of the first videos that I did on this channel, words don't have any power in and of themselves. They are not magic spells. They do not have some kind of mystical compulsion or ability to harm or force people to do things. There is still, if you have that level of control over yourself, you can take that step back. You can consider what's being said to you. You can weigh it up, and you can act. There's as a result, microaggressions, things like that, where you apparently somehow make someone else feel. No, I'm sorry. One of the things that you learn in retail, one of the jobs and kind of areas that is usually considered the lowest level of employment, one of the first things you do in that job, which a lot of people miss, is you need to learn how to control yourself. and control your emotions and realize that you're the only person that can. Because otherwise, every shitty customer, every crappy manager, every other co-worker that decides to do something shitty and leave you with it because they finished their shift, they are going to crush you. And so you need to make sure that your personal responsibility and control over yourself is very much the thing that you focus on, because otherwise you're just going to run into problem after problem after problem. And if you had a focus on things like microaggressions in a workplace like that, where speech equates to violence, then you would have a continual rolling door where you'd have a continually revolving door rather of various managers and various members of staff and customers that you would be actively throwing out all the time for no other reason that they said something that maybe that one person didn't agree with in the moment. You know, it doesn't really add up. And then he goes on to say, be open about the science of human nature, which very much includes the differences, the biological and neurological and psychological differences between men and women. And then he goes on to say about reconsidering making unconscious bias training mandatory for promo committees, which seems to be a very specific thing that he's talking about here, which who knows whether or not it's something that's affected him directly or something he's just seen. But he brings up three points where he says we haven't been able to measure any effect of unconscious bias training, and it has the potential for overcorrecting or backlash, especially if made mandatory. Some of the suggested methods of the current training, version 2.3 apparently within Google, are likely useful, but the political bias of the presentation is clear from the factual inaccuracies and examples shown, which again he doesn't go into here, but again, and this is one of the things that I've seen lots of people raise, oh well, he doesn't go into some specifics on this. Well, yeah, at the time he was seemingly hoping to keep his job and to put this stuff across to people for discussion internally, and yet as a result, being aware of that, either he's thinking, well, everyone that I'm sending this memo to probably already knows what I'm talking about, but also you can get crapped on quite significantly, especially for companies like Google, where they're very kind of private and keep their secrets under lock and key. You can get sacked for over-referencing or over-revealing things that are essentially company documents. But then he goes on to say, spend more time on many other types of biases besides stereotypes. Stereotypes are much more accurate and responsive to new information than the training suggests. I'm not advocating for using stereotypes. I'm just pointing out the factual inaccuracy of what's said in the training. And again, I would kind of agree with this. Stereotypes, for the most part, in a lot of instances, kind of exist for a reason. And then, you know, as a result of that, you see them change much more quickly. You know, each generation you have several new stereotypes pop up for certain types of individuals, and a lot of them are informed by reality because they are generalizations around cultures, subcultures, things that happen, groups of people, whatever. And so those generalizations, as I've said before, in the video that I did on generalizations, they are a tool. They are a tool for understanding. They are a tool for seeing patterns. They aren't necessarily saying that you will absolutely 100% apply those things to everybody else. The thing is, then you had the response, and let's get into the response, because you had a lot of people going, well, isn't this interesting? But then you had the backlash from Google, where you had some of their kind of top of the chain guys going, we feel that this has breached our policy and that this is furthering kind of damaging stereotypes or whatever it was, furthering gender stereotypes. And so as a result, we don't like it, and it's painful and harmful and blah blah blah. And you had that coming from the who was it? You had Danielle Brown, who was the Vice President of Diversity and Integrity and Governance, which, of course, this is basically a thing that has been put straight in front of her and said, well, you're not doing well enough, and these are some of the things that we're going to discuss, and here are some of the things that, you know, she's just backlashed against it straight away, where she says, here you go, she says that as she read it, she found that it advanced incorrect assumptions about gender, but gender being the experiential expression of biological sex to one extent or another, nothing that he said there is particularly inaccurate. But then the guy gets fired, the guy gets sacked, and of course this causes people, especially on platforms like YouTube, to kind of fly off in different directions about how you know, this affects them, how this you know, highlights a big problem that they are having, where they're seeing their videos get demonetized and censored as well, and how this seems to be a big focus for Google, where it all flies off in one direction. And you know, it's where you even had the woman in charge of Google, I can't remember her name now, coming and saying that she felt pain at reading it or at seeing it. And it's like, well, no, I'm sorry. If you felt pain, then again, that's on you, and it's an irrational sensation that you've come across. But the thing that interested me wasn't the people like, what was it, Slate, who did the article, Stop Equating Science with Truth, when, again, to quote Neil deGrasse Tyson, the good thing about science is that it's true whether or not you believe in it. You know, it's just as it is. You can argue with it as much as you like. You can claim that it isn't true as much as you like. It's still going to be the case. Yeah? And so you had people going, oh no, this is terrible, evolutionary psychology is a mistake and all the rest of it. And this is the thing, evolutionary psychology is the basis for further psychology. Yeah? Evolutionary psychology goes, here is the starting point, here is where we came from, and why these patterns emerged in what we do, how we act, how we grow, how we develop. But then you've got things like cognitive and behavioral therapies, or Christ, even kind of Freudian psychiatry, if you really want to go that way. The all then come back down and go, okay, well, now we're dealing with the individual. Yeah, me looking at it from a coaching side of things, where I go, okay, so we're going to inform ourselves from evolution in terms of biology and in terms of psychology, so that then we go and take a look and see what your situation is and how maybe your specific inclinations are going to like help you in one way or the other. You know, that's me going, okay, so we've got a basis of what you've told me and what we know you are. Now, how can we investigate you further to then apply what you are to a plan to help make it work for you? Yeah? It's all about making a start. It's all about having that solid basis at ground level to pick up from. And so people going, oh, it generalizes too much, it's this, it's that, it's the other. Well, yeah, you're talking about the evolutionary side of things. You're usually talking about kind of average trends across populations. But you've had a whole load of scientists come out and put their opinions across on this as well. And there was one article that has been shared around a lot that kind of stood out to me, from Quillette magazine, where they've picked up different articles, different responses from different people, and kind of compiled them. And so you've got a professor of social psychology at Rutgers University. You've got a personality psychology professor at the University of Michigan, or from the University of Michigan. No, sorry, he's now at Bradley University, or was recently. You've got another from the University of New Mexico, who is a professor in evolutionary psychology. And then you've also got Deborah So, who is a Toronto-based science writer, who has a PhD in sexual neuroscience from the University of York. And I've come across some of her work before, and I've seen it popping up in various places. But as a result, this article kind of stood out to me because you've got the social psychology professor going, who's going to be focused very much more on the behavioural side of things in a lot of ways. He's still going, yeah, whilst in his opinion not everything in there was 100% accurate, or again put out there in its fullest entirety. It wasn't some kind of rant. It was literally a very well thought out essay that seemed to raise questions and suggest solutions. It wasn't anything else, and most of the information behind it was accurate. And he made suggestions to Google about, how not to suppress conversation and opinions, and how to kind of remove morality from reasoning to kind of promote the development of successful strategies. Then you had the chap who was the chair of the psychology department at Bradley University in 2010, apparently, and he came and took a look, and he was like, well, I see the points being made here, but this isn't really my area of expertise, and there are points to be made, but I'm not seeing the full effect. But okay, so that's one in favour of and one kind of against. But then again, if he's a personality professor, or focusing on personality psychology, then he's going to be looking at the individual, so maybe this won't be a thing that he adds up to. But then we had the evolutionary psychology professor at the University of New Mexico, who pretty much said, yeah, the information that he was suggesting and the stuff that supported it was all solid information. It's all stuff that we've worked with, and it's got a huge amount of research behind it that demonstrates it from not just humans but across all kinds of different cultures, all kinds of different species, and it stands up on its own. And then we had Deborah So, who, as said, I've come across some of her work before in regards to a few different things, or some of her writing at any rate. And so then, though, she's come in and said, well, yeah, field of neuroscience, sex differences between men and women are, especially in regards to things like brain structure, function, and the causes of differences in personality and preferences, kind of as they express what their brain is telling them to do, they're understood to be true, because there is evidence from thousands of studies that are very strong studies, that involve everything from fMRI scans to more kind of interview-based studies and everything else along those lines. There's a huge amount of stuff there that supports evolutionary psychology having the effects as they are being mentioned in this document from this Google employee. And so, she's going, it's not really considered controversial or up for debate in neuroscience and in these kind of psychological fields around it either. It's very much just a case of, if you try to argue otherwise, or for a purely social influence focus, then you'd be laughed out of the house. And this is what I've said numerous times before. I'll leave a link to this article down in the description anyway. But now that we've talked about the kind of response to it, where you have the flare up from one side and the kind of meh from the other side and all that kind of thing, the thing that kind of springs out to me is that you've got these problems where these things become hugely controversial, and whether a company really wants to fight against them, whether they really think that they are entirely incorrect or whatever else, then they just start sacking people, or they start saying that it's against one policy or another. I've seen this in places that I've worked before, where someone has raised an issue and it's not been popular, and so then they have pushed that person out. But this is Google, for God's sake. This is the place where it's supposed to be a very forward-thinking, open environment to work within. And yet, this doesn't seem to demonstrate that at all. Yeah, it doesn't seem to kind of give that across in the slightest, considering that as soon as someone has raised this kind of opinion that seems to be very well thought out, is very dispassionately put across. You know, he's not ranting, he's not raving, he's not accusing people, he's literally just saying, this is a problem that I've observed. It is no one's fault necessarily, but it is a problem, and so as a result, here are my thoughts on it. Please discuss. And the way that they discuss is by telling him that even though he makes it very clear throughout the entire 10-page document that he's not espousing for just sexism or against diversity in full or anything like that, he's saying that the way that Google is doing it could be better and could be more scientific. And yet then they come out against him in force, saying that oh, his writing caused me pain, or this, that, and the other, and yet then, boom, you know, he gets sacked and he gets dropped completely. And I believe he's looking for a way to contest this legally, because if his stuff doesn't directly say what they said it does in regards to the kind of negative aspects of it, with the supposed kind of push for gender stereotypes and negative gender this, that, and the other, and blah blah blah, then, you know, this is wrongful dismissal, and he could sue the pants off them. And it's like, maybe, you know, if these people are working for you, maybe one of the good things you could do is sit down and listen to what they got to say, actually have a discussion about it, actually address the facts of the matter, you know, remove some of the ideology. I don't know. I mean, I'm going to be interested to see whether or not this video itself, with me trying to discuss it in a very open and straightforward way, where he's saying a lot of things that I've said in the past as well in various ways, but I'll be interested to see whether or not the algorithm, and then if I have to flag it up for review afterwards, if this video gets demonetized or kind of hits a brick wall. Because I've seen a lot of other YouTubers, when they've been discussing this, hitting that kind of brick wall. And so, you know, I'm going to be interested to see if that's because of the kind of channel that it's come from, whether or not it's the way that they addressed it, or what, and whether or not this video, considering I'm still very small, gets picked up in the same way. Because again, then that suggests that if there are lots of people getting these videos demonetized, if you're getting a lot of people who are just trying to discuss this, kind of getting brushed to one side, then that also means that if it's the algorithm that's doing it first, it means that Google, through YouTube, has put something in the algorithm to stop that then from being moved forward, which again supports the authoritarian claim that was made at the beginning of the memo. So I'm going to be interested to see how this all goes, what kind of comes of it, and I'm sure we'll hear some more of it soon. I realise that this is a bit of a longer video, but, you know, a 10-page document plus all of these other articles and things that are coming out, you know, it's something that kind of needed to be addressed, I think. And so, yeah, tell me what you guys think about the memo. Have you read it? Have you not? Is this the first you're hearing of it? But, you know, what do you think of the content? What do you think of the fact that this guy, quite rightly so, has used evolutionary psychology for a basis, has used a kind of critical eye on the kind of culture and ideologies employed at the workplace to try and improve it? And what do you think about the way he's been treated? What do you think about the response? I'm interested to know. Again, he started a conversation. I hope we can too. But otherwise, guys, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the video tomorrow. Take care. Thank you very much for watching, guys. If you found this at all interesting, then please drop us a like, share this video, and subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the video tomorrow. Take care.